I still remember the night. Everything changed. I was standing on the trail with my bow in hand, breathing hard, my blood boiling. Across from me were three HOA members, Richard, Linda, and Thomas. They didn't belong here. They stood in their neat clothes, their polished shoes, like they were about to attend a meeting in some office building, not confront me in the middle of the woods. Richard pointed at me and said, "You're breaking the law. Hunter, put the weapon down." I laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. The law. I shouted back. This land fed my father, and his father before him. I've hunted here my whole life. You think you own the forest because you print out rules on fancy paper? Linda whispered something to Richard, her voice shaking. She was scared, I could tell. But Richard wasn't. He looked me dead in the eye and smirked. That smirk still burns in my memory. "Mark," he said calmly, "you signed a community agreement. No hunting. You broke the rule. If you continue, we'll fine you. And if you don't pay, we'll take you to court." I stepped so close to him I could smell his cologne, cheap and artificial, nothing like the real scent of pine and soil around us. My hand shook on my bow. My heart hammered. You think a piece of paper will erase generations of tradition? You think you can tell me how to live on my own land? My voice cracked with rage. You don't even know what dangerous means. Richard didn't even blink. He leaned in and whispered, "Then get ready to lose everything." For a moment, I wanted to put an arrow into the dirt right at his feet, just to watch him flinch. But instead, I roared and slammed my bow into the ground. The crack echoed through the forest. Then I turned and stormed off, my dog Ranger following close behind me. That was the night the war began. Back in my cabin, I sat by the fire, staring at the pictures of my father and grandfather. Men with strong hands, standing proudly with their hunts. They taught me everything I know, how to track a deer in the snow, how to move silently through the forest, how to respect the life you take. Hunting wasn't just sport for us. It was survival. It was honor. It was blood. I looked at Ranger lying by my feet, his brown eyes watching me as if he understood. "They don't get it," I muttered. "The HOA, the families with their hiking sticks and cameras. They think the forest is some playground. They walk the trails, throw their trash, and call it nature time. They don't know what it means to truly live off the land, to fight for every meal, to respect every tree, every animal." My chest tightened. My father would roll in his grave if he saw me being told I couldn't hunt in the very woods he raised me in. The next morning, the official flyers came. Glossy, bold letters that screamed at me. Hunting is strictly prohibited. Violators will be fined $1,000 per offense. I crumpled the paper so hard it tore in my fist. At the community meeting that evening, I stood in the back while Richard smiled his politician smile at everyone. "This rule," he said, "is about safety. We cannot allow weapons in areas where children play. Imagine if something happened. We're protecting families." People nodded. Some clapped. My blood boiled. I stepped forward, my voice like thunder. "Safety? Don't talk to me about safety. I've hunted here for 30 years. Not one person has ever been hurt. You ban me. But you let teenagers blast music on the trails, leave beer cans in the bushes, light campfires they don't know how to control. And I'm a danger." Silence fell. Some people looked guilty. Others avoided my eyes. Richard just smiled wider. "Rules are rules, Mr. Hunter. If you don't like it, you can leave." Those words hit me like a knife to the chest. Leave? Leave the land my family built a life on? Leave the only place I've ever truly belonged? Not a chance. That night, I sat on my porch staring into the forest. The moon lit up the trees in silver. Ranger curled up at my feet. I thought about every time I had walked the trails as a boy, every lesson my father whispered to me as we tracked deer prints in the mud. I thought about the times when hunting was the only thing that put food on our table. And then I thought about the hikers, the families laughing too loud, the teenagers throwing trash, the couples taking selfies with the trees. They treated the forest like a theme park, but I was the one being punished. It wasn't fair. The more I thought about it, the more one idea burned in my mind. If they could take away my hunting, why couldn't I take away their hiking? The forest was mine long before it was theirs. If they wanted to ban me, maybe it was time they felt what it was like to be shut out. I stood up, my hands curling into fists. I stared at the dark forest, as if it was calling to me, daring me to act. They wanted war. I whispered to the night. Now they'll get it. The wind howled through the trees, carrying my words like a warning. If you were in my place, your family's traditions banned, your way of life stolen, would you stay silent or would you fight back? People think revenge comes in one big move. They imagine explosions, gunfire, or fists flying. But real revenge? It starts quietly, like a seed planted in the ground, growing day by day until it's strong enough to choke everything around it. That seed had already been planted inside me the night Richard smirked and told me I should leave. I wasn't leaving. Not now. Not ever. So I started watching. Every morning, I woke up before dawn. Ranger and I would sit hidden in the trees just off the main trail. I'd watch them. Families with strollers, teenagers with backpacks, runners with water bottles strapped to their waists. They didn't see me, of course. That was the first thing my father taught me about hunting. The forest only speaks to those who know how to listen. And what I heard, what I saw, it made my blood boil. Trash left behind. Candy wrappers. Bottles. Loud voices scaring off the deer. Dogs running off-leash, chasing rabbits. They claimed they wanted safety. They claimed they wanted to protect the forest. But every single day, they proved the opposite. And I thought to myself, if they can ruin the trails without punishment, why can't I shut the trails down completely? I started small. One evening, I went out with a toolbox and loosened a few of the wooden planks on the bridge that crossed the creek. Not enough to hurt anyone. Just enough that when a hiker stepped on it, the board would groan and sag, sending a message. This place isn't safe anymore. The next morning, sure enough, Richard sent an email to the whole community. Attention! Some sections of the hiking trail are under repair. Please use caution. I smiled when I read it. They didn't know yet, but they would. The HOA thought they had won by banning my hunting. But each time I saw one of their signs, "No hunting," nailed to a tree, it felt like they were spitting on my father's grave. So I started pulling them down. At night, I'd slip into the woods with Ranger by my side and rip the signs out one by one. By morning, the posts stood empty like broken teeth in a jaw. The HOA put new signs up. I tore them down again. It became a game I was winning. But Richard wasn't stupid. He knew it was me. One Saturday afternoon, I caught him on the trail with two other HOA members. They were checking the signs, measuring spots for new ones. Richard looked up and saw me standing at the tree line. For a moment, we just stared at each other. No words, no smiles, just a silent war. Finally, he called out, "You think you can scare us, Hunter? You think tearing down a few signs will change anything?" I stepped forward, the leaves crunching under my boots. My voice was low, steady, deadly calm. "I don't want to scare you, Richard. I want to remind you that these woods don't belong to you. And if you keep pushing me, you'll lose more than just signs." His smile faltered just for a second. Then he laughed, but it was forced. "We'll see about that." They walked off, but I knew they felt it, the shift in the air. The forest wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine again. That night, sitting by the fire, I started sketching plans. I knew every inch of those trails, every weak bridge, every steep hill, every hidden path that hikers never noticed but hunters always knew. I thought, what if the bridges broke down? What if the trails were blocked? What if the paths became dangerous? The HOA wanted safe, pretty trails for their families. I wanted them gone. And so, piece by piece, I began to design their downfall. A week later, I made my first real move. I went out late, when the moon was high, carrying a hatchet and rope. On the southern trail, there was an old tree leaning too close to the path. I swung my hatchet into its trunk, deep and sharp, over and over, until the wood cracked. Then I tied the rope, pulled with all my strength, and watched the tree crash across the trail. By morning, hikers couldn't pass. The HOA sent out another email. Trail closed for maintenance. Maintenance? That word made me laugh out loud. The neighbors started whispering. Some thought storms were damaging the trails. Others suspected vandals. A few, just a few, looked at me differently when I passed them on the street. They knew, and I didn't deny it. I didn't confirm it either. I just gave them a look that said, "You don't want to ask me. You don't want to know the truth." The truth was simple. The HOA took my hunting. I was taking their hiking. Now let me ask you something. If you were in my shoes, if the only life you ever knew was stripped away by people who didn't understand, would you really just sit back? Would you let them decide who you are, what you can do, how you can live? Or would you fight back, even if it meant breaking every one of their so-called rules? Think about it. By the time summer rolled around, 2 trails were closed. Bridges were broken. Trees blocked paths. Signs disappeared. And yet Richard kept fighting me, sending out his emails, pretending the HOA was in control. But he didn't see what I saw. I saw fear in his eyes every time we crossed paths. I saw neighbors whisper when I walked by. They were starting to understand. The forest didn't belong to them anymore. It belonged to me. You know what I learned about people? They're brave when they sit in meetings, holding clipboards and drinking coffee. But take them out of their comfort zone, make them face the dirt, the dark, the wild, and suddenly they're not so brave anymore. That's what I wanted. I wanted the HOA and their happy little hikers to feel fear every time they stepped into the woods. I wanted them to look over their shoulders, to question if the trail was safe, if they belonged here at all. So I stopped playing games. I stopped pulling down signs. I stopped cutting single trees. No, I went bigger. I started shutting down their trails for real. The Northern Trail was their favorite. Families loved it because it had a scenic overlook where you could see the whole valley. Teenagers loved it because it was far enough from the houses that they could drink beer without being caught. That trail became my first target. One night, under the cover of darkness, I carried a shovel and heavy chains. I dug deep holes right across the main path, covered them with leaves and branches. Then I dragged fallen logs across other parts of the trail, stacking them high. When the hikers came the next morning, they couldn't pass. Some tried, but when their legs sank into the holes, they screamed and backed out. By noon, the HOA sent another email. Northern Trail closed until further notice. I laughed until my stomach hurt. But I didn't stop there. There was a wooden bridge on the Western Trail, a fragile thing built by volunteers years ago. I knew every weak spot. Late one night, I loosened the nails, pulled out some support beams, left it looking fine but ready to collapse under weight. The next morning, a group of hikers stepped onto it. The wood cracked, split, and half the bridge dropped into the stream. No one got hurt, thank God, but the screams echoed all the way back to the neighborhood. The HOA rushed in with yellow caution tape, wagging their fingers and warning everyone about safety hazards. Safety hazards. That's what they call me now. The whispers spread faster than wildfire. Someone's sabotaging the trails. It's Mark Hunter. He's dangerous. Don't confront him. Some people crossed the street when they saw me. Others gave me looks filled with fear or maybe respect. I couldn't always tell. But here's the truth. I didn't care what they thought. Because for the first time since the HOA banned my hunting, I felt powerful again. Of course, Richard wasn't going to let it go. One evening, as I was chopping wood outside my cabin, he pulled up in his shiny black SUV. He didn't even get out. He rolled down his window and shouted, "Hunter, this is going to end. Do you hear me? The board is meeting with lawyers. We'll get a restraining order. We'll have you arrested." I leaned on my axe and looked at him, calm as the night sky. "You think the law scares me, Richard? The forest doesn't answer to your lawyers. It answers to me." He cursed, slammed his car door shut, and drove off, gravel spitting under his tires. Ranger barked after him. I just smiled. By midsummer, 3 out of 4 main trails were closed. The community Facebook page was filled with complaints. No safe place to hike anymore. My kids used to love the Northern Trail. Now it's blocked. Why isn't the HOA doing something? I read every comment with a grin. Richard posted updates like a desperate man. "We're working on repairs, volunteers needed. Please stay patient." But no matter how hard they worked, I tore it down again. Logs across the trail. Nails scattered on the path. Signs ripped out of the ground. They couldn't keep up with me. But something strange happened in the middle of all this. Not everyone hated me. One night, as I was walking back from the woods, an older neighbor named John stopped me. He looked around, making sure no one was watching, and said quietly, "You're doing what we all wish we could." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He sighed. "The HOA's been controlling us for years. They fine us for grass being too long, for paint being the wrong shade. They think they own us. You're the only one who stood up to them. I didn't know what to say. For the first time, I realized I wasn't fighting alone. Some people, maybe not many, but some, were rooting for me. And here's where I stop and ask you something. If you saw your freedom stripped away, if the rules kept choking you, would you break them? Would you risk being hated, maybe even arrested, just to feel alive again? Or would you stay silent, go along, and let someone else decide who you are? Because me, I couldn't stay silent. Not anymore. By the end of that summer, the HOA had lost control. 3 trails shut down, bridges broken, families too scared to walk in the woods. Richard kept sending his emails, calling for order, for safety, for patience. But his words were empty, because deep down, he knew the truth. The forest no longer belonged to the HOA. It belonged to me, and I wasn't done yet. The HOA thought rules and lawyers could control me. But I controlled the forest, and the forest controlled them. Do you think Richard will back down? Or will he push me into a final showdown? I never thought it would come to this. A man standing in front of his own land, fighting not against strangers, not against thieves, but against his own neighbors, people who claimed they wanted a better community. The morning of the showdown, the air felt heavy. Fog hung low between the trees, and every sound, the crack of a branch, the cry of a crow, echoed like a warning. I knew today wasn't going to be about rules or papers or signatures. Today was going to be about who had the courage to stand their ground. They came in numbers: HOA members, lawyers, even some neighbors I'd once shared dinners with. At the front, of course, was Richard. His sharp suit looked out of place among the mud and leaves of my land, but his voice carried the arrogance of a man who thought he already won. "Mark," he said, raising his hand like he was some kind of king, "this ends today. You've blocked access to community property. You've violated every agreement. Either you take down those fences, or we'll take them down ourselves." I laughed. Not the kind of laugh that comes from joy, but the kind that rises when anger has burned so long it starts to taste like iron. "Community property?" I said, stepping forward. "You mean my forest? My trails? The land I cleared, the paths I maintained, the trees I planted? You didn't build this, Richard. You just came with your papers and thought you owned it." His face tightened. Around him, a few of the younger neighbors shifted nervously. They weren't as sure as him. They'd seen me work these woods. They knew the truth. Still, Richard raised his voice. "You don't own rights. You signed the HOA contract when you bought your home. You agreed." I held his stare. "I agreed to live here. I never agreed to let men like you own my life." One of his men stepped forward with bolt cutters, heading toward my barricade on the trail. That was the moment my blood boiled. "Take one more step," I warned, "and you'll regret it." The man froze, looking back at Richard, and then I asked the question that silenced everyone standing there. "Tell me, all of you, how would you feel if someone walked into your home, sat down on your couch, and told you that you weren't allowed to sit there anymore? Would you bow your head and say thank you? Or would you fight back?" There was no answer, only shifting feet, lowered eyes, because they knew I wasn't just fighting for hunting or hiking trails. I was fighting for the one thing every human being needs: freedom. But Richard wasn't one to back down. He pulled out his weapon. Not a gun, not his fists, but a stack of legal papers. He waved them like holy scripture. "This is bigger than you, Mark. The law is on my side. You'll lose everything: your land, your home. Is that what you want?" For a moment, the words cut deeper than I expected. Lose my land, my home, the forest I had lived in, sweated in, bled in? But then I remembered something. Something Richard didn't know. I had proof. Months before, I had uncovered the HOA's dirty secret. They weren't protecting nature. They weren't keeping the community safe. They had signed deals with developers, agreements to sell off parts of the forest for private projects. The hiking trails weren't about community at all. They were about profit. I pulled the folder from my jacket and held it high for everyone to see. "You want to talk about agreements, Richard? Fine. Let's talk about yours." I opened the folder and scattered copies of the documents across the ground. Neighbors bent down, picked them up, read them. And slowly, the gasps began. "These are contracts," I said, my voice steady. Contract signed by Richard and his board to hand over our forest, our land, to developers. They want to build cabins, shops, even a private resort. And they use your HOA fees to fund it. Eyes turned, not toward me, but toward him. Richard's face went pale. That's not true, he barked, but his voice cracked under the weight of the evidence. Oh, it's true, I said, stepping closer. And while you were busy accusing me of breaking rules, you were selling the very ground beneath us. The crowd was no longer his. Murmurs spread. People I'd known for years, quiet, polite neighbors, were suddenly angry. You told us the hunting ban was for safety, one woman shouted. You said the trails were community-owned, another added. You lied to us, Richard. Richard backed away, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. The man with the bolt cutters dropped them on the ground and shook his head. For the first time, I saw fear in Richard's eyes. And that's when I realized I had already won. Not by fists, not by fences, but by truth. In the weeks that followed, Richard was voted out of the HOA board. Investigations were launched. Those contracts, they burned him alive in the eyes of the community. He disappeared, humiliated, stripped of the power he thought he could use against me. The hunting ban? Gone. The trails? Left untouched unless I allowed access. And the neighbors? Some apologized, some stayed quiet, but all of them finally understood. I didn't fight the HOA because I love conflict. I fought because sometimes the only way to protect what's yours is to stand up, even if you have to stand alone. Now, when I walk the forest at dawn, bow in hand, I don't just hear the rustle of leaves or the call of a deer. I hear silence, the silence of respect. No one tells me what I can or cannot do on my land anymore. And sometimes I wonder if I hadn't fought back, if I had just rolled over like Richard expected, how much more would they have taken? That's the question I leave with you. If your freedom was threatened by people hiding behind rules and contracts, would you stay silent? Or would you fight back like I did? Tell me in the comments. Is community control more important than personal freedom? And if my story made you think twice about standing up for what's yours, share it. Because you never know who else needs to hear that sometimes the fight is worth it.